Hi, and welcome to Ivy English. I'm Karen.
And I'm Chris Gorski.
Today is July 11th, and today we have an article for you about a special kind of house.
That's right, and this special kind of house is actually found on the very same property of another larger house.
And the title of our article is?
Granny Flats, Cheap, Sustainable Living for People of All Ages.
Do you know what I thought the first time I read this title?
I don't know. What did you think when you first read this?
I was thinking of shoes for old ladies. Because
yes,
flats are a kind of shoes that do not have a high heel.
Right, and granny, you might be thinking these are kind of posturepedic, or these are one of these things that shape your feet and keep you in good condition. I very much could see how you arrived at that position.
I wouldn't think of the posturepedic shoes. I was just thinking of when you're at that age, you're not going to wear high heels anymore in most cases.
Is it those are the really big, thick shoes? I remember the grandmas when I was a kid. They would wear those, these incredibly thick-heeled shoes.
Yeah, that's right. I think they often had like foot problems they were trying to correct, or they wanted something that was a little softer for their feet. But definitely after, it depends on the woman, but definitely probably after 45, you're kind of sick of high heels. Clack, 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 clack around the office. I used to do that.
My wife used to do that too, and now that you mention it, I don't recall her wearing high heels in the past few years, and she's begun to prefer flat shoes more. But they still have to be graceful, very feminine, just not the high heel.
Yeah, you can have very pretty shoes that are flat. I think the change often takes place when you have your first child, very often.
Yeah, I could imagine, right? If you have to carry a kid around, it gets hard. But we're not talking about high heels today.
No, that's right. So all this talk about granny flats is not about shoes. It's about buildings, as we said earlier. Okay, here's our article. Granny Flats, Cheap, Sustainable Living for People of All Ages. When you hear the words tiny house, you probably think they refer quite simply to a very small house. However, this term actually represents dwellings of a specific size, those with no more than 37 square meters of floor space. Often, a tiny house is located on the property of a larger dwelling and is built to accommodate an additional family member. Since the individual living in a tiny house is often an elderly relative, these structures have increasingly been referred to as granny flats in recent years. However, the more formal term for this kind of building is an accessory dwelling unit, ADU.
A typical ADU is essentially a small version of a regular house, complete with basic kitchen and bathroom facilities. Due to the recent boom in popularity of these homes for housing the elderly, some modern ADUs also include advanced features like built-in medicine dispensers and even toilets that can conduct urine analyses.
ADUs also offer other advantages. First, their construction on pre-existing properties maximizes land use, making them a more sustainable choice than traditional houses. ADUs also require fewer materials to build and less energy to power. Moreover, ADUs could help alleviate the housing crisis by allowing young people without their own houses to live on their parents' property while still maintaining independence.
As remote work becomes more common and the global housing crisis worsens, the growth in ADUs is not surprising. These small living spaces provide practical solutions to the changing needs of individuals and families. Because they perfectly integrate into existing real estate, ADUs offer a sustainable alternative for housing. So, if you start seeing these living units popping up in your neighborhood, don't be too surprised.
Now, I have seen a lot about small houses for a very long time, and usually they are introduced as something very, very cute. They will say, well, here's a tour of the small house of this person. They built it themselves, all kinds of other things about it. And you think, wow, that looks so tidy and so cool and so cute and easy to clean. You get all excited about these small houses. I've been watching these videos for many years. However, recently I've been hearing some different views of small houses. I've been reading about people who moved out because they said, there's just not enough space.
Yeah. I immediately started thinking about where do you put anything for multiple seasons? If you live in a very climate-stable area, then maybe that's okay. But I often think of the turnover that we need to do in Taiwan here for winter and then summer. There is a major difference in the way my house feels during the winter versus summer. And it requires changing out all sorts of stuff. And it's kind of problematic. Where do you put it when you have a very tiny space that we will see in our article later?
And this is not to mention upstate New York and Minnesota.
Oh, yeah. When you're talking about sub-zero temperatures, you better have insulation and blankets and bedding and sweaters. All of that takes space. And you can see that's pretty much the big limitation here. You need to give up everything that you may or may not want have accumulated in order to fit in a space this size.
I will quickly add to that. We have the opposite problem in the U.S., that people think a big house is a symbol of high status. Yeah. And people get bigger and bigger and bigger houses. They're so big that they don't even know all their rooms very well, and they just keep filling up the rooms with stuff. They do not need that space. So we have to find a happy medium here somewhere.
I think so, and I'm reflecting upon people I grew up. I knew a few wealthy people growing up, and they had colossal houses and just incredibly large yards. And I was just thinking about it. They would mow it themselves.
Oh,
they had fun, like riding their lawnmower around their yard.
Yeah.
And I was just thinking, man, this just takes us. Must just
so
take all their time.
Yes. Even if you've got that little tractor.
That's exactly what they had. And, you know, this is back in the day before you had your Spotify in your pocket and Bluetooth headphones. Just sitting here at the lawnmower sound for 90 minutes. This is terrible.
Yeah, and you have to often wear earplugs.
Yep, that's right.
All right, let's go back to the beginning. Our title again, Granny Flats, Cheap, Sustainable Living for People of All Ages. Now, the word granny is a cute little diminutive, we'd say, for the word grandmother. So we can call you grandmother, but it's really formal. Just like we don't say mother, I'm home, or father, I'm here. We don't usually say grandmother, we say grandma. And then the D kind of disappears, so grandma. Now, this is most common in the States, and they also use it in England. However, I have noticed that in British English, granny is much, much more common than it is in American English. In American English, granny makes me think of the Beverly Hillbillies, a TV show of people who moved up from, I think, Kentucky or somewhere.
Yeah, I don't remember where they're from, but you're exactly right. That is the only granny I can think of largely in pop culture besides a song. But the song was written by a person that grew up in the British Empire. So I wonder if that's not the direct connection there.
It could be.
Yeah.
So just remember, granny is more common in British English. In my observation, in U.S. English, I usually say grandma. And flat. Now, that is also British. So earlier, Chris was telling me that you saw a lot of websites for these kinds of homes for Australia.
That's right. So on the websites that I was reading about, I was looking into them and wanted to know a little bit more detail than we had in the article here. And they were very Australian-focused websites. This is not to say that they're not present in other places, but maybe they're especially popular in Australia right now.
So just like the word granny, which tends to be more British, flat is also a British term, which they also use in Australia. It means apartment or a place to stay. I never used to say it, but then I started having a lot of British friends, and I got to say, oh, I left it in my flat. I've gotten used to it, but it's still self-conscious. In America, we call it an apartment.
Yeah, I think you would stand out if you called it a flat in the United States.
Yeah, someone would say, oh, you're showing off your friendship with this British person, right? Or something like that. Okay, so granny flats, this is definitely more British or Australian. All right, cheap, sustainable living. Cheap means it costs less. Sustainable means that it works over the long term. It's not just good for a couple weeks. So like, for example, as Chris said, when you change seasons, is everything okay when you change seasons? Do you have enough room to put all those heavy blankets and heavy jackets away in? So sustainable means something that will work over the long term for people of all ages. And you will see in the article, they talk about two major age groups who can benefit from this kind of housing. So the title again, Granny Flats, Cheap, Sustainable Living for People of All Ages. First paragraph, when you hear the words tiny house, you probably think they refer quite simply to a very small house. Now, out of context, it can. So you can say these friends of mine, they have a really tiny house. It is not the kind of house they're talking about here. It just means they have a very small house.
My first impression here was, that's what a tiny house means. So I reacted directly to the question of the article. Tiny house, it's a small house.
That's all. All right, and watch the stress, because the first time it appears in writing, you're going to say tiny house. But the particular kind of house they're talking about here, the stress is different. It's a tiny house because it is already a thing. It's a very specific kind of small house. Okay? However, this term actually represents dwellings of a specific size, those with no more than 37 square meters of floor space. This is another sign that it probably is not talking about the U.S. because we don't normally measure in meters. We're one of the very few places in the entire world that does not.
Yeah, I actually checked this. This is just 11 ping, and we don't speak Chinese on these particular articles. However, I also learned that this is actually a nice umbrella term. So it's just 11 ping, and ping in English means exactly the same in Chinese, so I'm not cheating. A dwelling is just a different kind of house. So there are many kinds of houses or homes, and dwelling is just that nice umbrella term.
In fact, the word ping comes from Japanese, and the Japanese pronunciation of ping is tsubo, T-S-U-B-O, tsubo. So if you want to avoid Chinese, you can say it in Japanese, but I think for us expats here, we won't know what you're talking about.
I wouldn't know what it means. And honestly, I did not know how big 37 square meters is because I don't think in that size, even though I'm quite comfortable with meters and centimeters. In terms of houses, it didn't make sense to me. I actually had to think about it in ping, like in Taiwan. I'm like, okay, 11 ping house. How big is that? It's probably too small for me, but I could imagine and see it and feel it only then. So there you go.
I'm okay with square feet. I'm still a bit used to square feet, but that's only after I match it up with ping, just like you. Okay, often a tiny house is located on the property of a larger dwelling and is built to accommodate an additional family member. This sentence contains a lot of important information. Once you get this sentence, you'll know what the heck is going on here. So it is not on a separate lot, L-O-T. Lot is a piece of land where you're going to build something like a house or a factory. So it doesn't have its own lot of its own. It is actually on the lot of a house that's already existing. So it's part of some existing property that you are able to use for a new building. So it's located on the property of a larger dwelling. It's going to be smaller than that other building or house that's on that lot, and it is built for a specific purpose. It is so that you can allow someone to live there who belongs to your family.
When we accommodate someone, that usually means we try to make their situation pretty convenient. Here what we're saying is we're trying to give them a house to live, and so we actually have this verb in English, to house somebody. A lot of times that S will actually turn into a Z sound, to house somebody.
If it's a verb.
If it's a verb. And you will just hear this pretty commonly. So we often have housing crises, and we can house people in different kinds of dwellings.
That's right. To accommodate someone in a hotel room, in a house, in a building, wherever it is. If we have enough room and we can take care of them there, we are accommodating them. Since the individual living in a tiny house is often an elderly relative, these structures have increasingly been referred to as granny flats in recent years. And as we mentioned earlier, this is British or Australian. We probably would not think of that in the U.S.
No, I agree. I think that this is a kind of terrible name, if I'm being honest. Because there is a lot of negative stereotypes associated with being old. I don't necessarily have them, but I do realize that these exist. And this was one of the clues that this is not really an American phenomenon, at least this name, because of that association with the elderly, older folks, and grannies being kind of a negative thing.
Absolutely.
But I think it's what we'll see in this article is actually it's like a really great idea for an aging family member that needs independence.
Right. So I have 3 grandchildren already, and I love them like crazy. And I don't mind being called grandma. I'm totally used to that. But I would not be used to being called granny. That's the way it is with American English. So it's often for an older person, so they call it granny flats. Now, the other negative thing with granny flats, the first thing I thought of is shoes for a granny. And the other thing I thought of granny getting mowed flat by traffic. It's the other thing I thought of. So I did not think of a house at all or an apartment.
Like getting hit by a steamroller, yeah.
In a cartoon.
To me, like the shoes that you're talking about are like the living sign of old people. Because I remember those people where I grew up wearing those granny flat shoes, those big, thick heeled shoes.
Orthopedic shoes.
And just, holy smokes, did they just look like the oldest things in the world.
I will spell the word orthopedic for you. That means that they are designed so that it's good for your posture. So ortho means good or correct, O-R-T-H-O, ortho. And pedic, P-E-D, means foot, so it's good for your foot, orthopedic shoes. As soon as we hear that, we smell old people's smells in our mind.
Yeah, maybe.
Like Ben Gay or something like that. However, the more formal term for this kind of building is an accessory dwelling unit, ADU. And Chris and I think both agreed that this is a very forgettable name.
This is even worse than granny flat.
Yes, it's worse.
At least with granny flat, I didn't have that initial misunderstanding you did where you were thinking about the shoes.
I'm female.
Yeah, I thought I was like, okay, at least with a granny flat, I know that we're talking about an apartment for older people. And there's probably certain accommodations made that to give them a more comfortable living space. Accessory dwelling unit, man, that's super forgettable.
For many reasons. Accessory is a common word in American English, but we're talking about purses and belts and things like that. Those are accessories. And dwelling is a fancy word for living. And unit is just a thing. One piece of a thing is called a unit. So all three words are very bureaucratic.
So I imagine downsizing yourself from your normal home and then saying, listen, Mom, listen, Dad, you're getting kind of old now. We need you to move into this place. We want to give you your independence. But this is just 37 square meters of floor space, 11 ping. You need to get rid of a lifetime of your memories and treasures. It must be exceptionally difficult.
This is something I'm actually working on right now, getting rid of a lot of that stuff so my kids don't have to do it.
It sounds really difficult. I kind of dread the day I'll need to do it.
You have to do it bit by bit.
Let's go to our next paragraph. A typical ADU is essentially a small version of a regular house, complete with basic kitchen and bathroom facilities. Now, your facility is just the things that you normally find in your house. Just think room, okay? There's a normal kitchen. There's a normal bathroom. Facility is just kind of an extra word here saying things. FAC is just Latin for easy. So it's easy to take a shower in the bathroom. It's not as easy to take a shower in your living room.
Or you could use the word facilities all by itself. I said, excuse me, Chris, do you mind if I use the facilities?
Great point. Yeah, this is very clear what it means.
It means the bathroom.
Let's look at our next sentence. Due to the recent boom in popularity of these homes for housing the elderly, some modern ADUs also include advanced features like built-in medicine dispensers and even toilets that can conduct urine analyses.
That's kind of amazing. Not something I would really want, but I guess if your health is not that wonderful, it's good to monitor it.
Pay attention. We use the word elderly, granny. We're talking about all these words about getting older, but we haven't said the word old because it feels kind of negative. It feels kind of difficult. We don't really like to say this word. There are a lot of ways to talk about your age. Old is probably one of the worst.
It's not very politically correct.
And it's time to level up our English, isn't it? Old is a word we learned when we were little kids. Urine is just pee-pee. We need to know. If you don't know what that word means, it just means when you go to the bathroom, the water comes out. Let's look at the word dispenser. This is a Latin verb that means to weigh out. And what does a medicine dispenser do? It carefully measures out or weighs out the medicine that you need to take. An analysis is a nice Greek word that means to loosen. So when we want to unloosen something, we can carefully examine it. So an analysis or analyses, this is a very detailed check of something.
And Chris mentioned that we kind of try to avoid the word old because it's not politically correct. There's one you have to avoid even more carefully than old.
I can't think of it. Which word?
Fat.
Yeah, I agree.
Better not say that.
I teach my young kids this, my students this. Don't say this word. There are lots of ways to say it. There are lots of ways.
Yeah, and often in Chinese, you'll say, oh, you've put on a few pounds recently. Yeah, you've gotten a little fat.
Very
Whoa,
direct.
don't do that in English. We're really touchy about our weight in the States because there are so many overweight people. Next paragraph, ADUs also offer other advantages. That's pretty straightforward. So these are not the only good things about ADUs. First, their construction on pre-existing properties maximizes land use, making them a more sustainable choice than traditional houses. So Chris and I, before the program, were discussing about our yards back in the States. Often they are not used for very much. They're just kind of sitting there and you have to cut the grass.
Yeah, that's right. Because of where my apartment was located, we actually had, it wasn't a granny flat back in the 1980s, but we had a smaller house on the same property as our apartment, and families would come in for a short time. They were generally going through some hard times, if I'm being honest, as an adult. And I hope they're all doing okay, because I know at the time they were probably, maybe month to month living, and it was not a good situation.
And a lot of people now are growing vegetables and other things we can eat instead of in their yards rather than having just grass, which is, I think, a great idea.
I agree.
ADUs also require fewer materials to build and less energy to power. And that's straightforward. It's easy to build them because they're small. You don't need so much energy because you're not going to need to heat up a large space, for example. Moreover, ADUs could help alleviate the housing crisis by allowing young people without their own houses to live on their parents' property while still maintaining independence. So this is often a really big thing that you have to solve. Like when you are becoming an adult or have become an adult, but you don't have a lot of money, where are you going to live? Well, this is one way to solve the problem.
If your father or if your mother and father have money, this is a great solution. In Sydney, Australia, you should expect to pay between 3 million NT dollars and 6 million NT dollars for a granny flat. If your mom and dad have it, great. If not, good luck. Let's go to our next paragraph here. As remote work becomes more common and the global housing crisis worsens, the growth in ADUs is not surprising. When something worsens, that means it was bad and it's getting even worse.
So it's not surprising that people have tried to find a cheaper alternative.
These small living spaces provide practical solutions to the changing needs of individuals and families, and I think also the changing values of the people living in them. People, I think, generally don't want the giant house and the giant backyard as much as they did in the past.
That's right. That's a new trend.
Because they perfectly integrate into existing real estate, ADUs offer a sustainable alternative for housing.
So that means that they actually work, and this will work over the long term. You can live there for a few years and you'll still be okay.
They're permanent structures. They don't move like actual tiny houses do.
Or like a trailer house.
That's right. That's basically what a tiny house is. It's kind of a really fancy trailer house. Let's continue. So, if you start seeing these living units popping up in your neighborhood, don't be too surprised.
Yeah, I wonder if there are any in Taiwan. We have a few questions for you. Number 1, what is the main purpose of ADUs?
And our answer is letter B, to offer a living space for an extra family member. Number 2, which of the following features of an ADU is not mentioned in this passage?
And the answer is C. The home is always capable of being moved to another location. That was not mentioned. We did talk about trailer homes, but that's not what they're talking about in the article.
Number 3, which of the following is true about ADUs according to the passage?
The answer is B. Besides easing the housing crisis worldwide, ADUs offer a sustainable option for housing.
Number 4, which word best describes the author's attitude toward ADUs?
Our choices here are A, optimistic, B, disappointed, C, doubtful, and D, curious. And the correct answer is
optimistic.
Letter A.
That's right. So you have a real positive feeling towards these. And sure, we have this great living solution for the older people in our life that maybe need a little more independence. I lived in Taiwan for 5 years. I went home to the United States for 4, and then I eventually came back. When I first went back to the United States, I lived with my mom for a very short time to save a little rent money while we were looking for our own apartment. And it was very difficult living with my adult mother. She still really saw me as a child.
Yeah.
And although she wasn't overbearing, I could tell she really didn't recognize me as an independent person at this point. I was almost 30 years old at this point. And it was challenging. And I imagine that's a thing that must continue through a lot of families. And so having this independent living space seems like a really interesting option if you can afford it.
Right. As a mother, I understand what was going on. That's it for today. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Take care.